So in Chapter 10, we're going to be exploring ethical and legal aspects of working with groups. And hopefully this was just a bit of a refresher for you from our ethics course. So as we probably remember from our ethics course, and hopefully a lot of this is just a refresher, ethics are standards of conduct based on professional values that in our case are set forth through the ACA Code of Ethics and through the Association for Specialist and Group Work Best Practices guides. And so because a lot of this chapter was probably a bit of a refresher from our ethics course, I'm really just going to hit the highlights of how all of this applies in a group setting as opposed to going over it in general. So we know that practitioners have this ethical responsibility to be professional and to behave in a way that aligns with those professional values set forth in the preamble of the ACA Code of Ethics, and that we have an obligation when ethical dilemmas arise, which they often do, and especially do in group settings, that we use an ethical decision-making process like that decision-making guide that we used in our class. So we probably remember that in the ACA Code of Ethics preamble, they did identify some values of counseling professionals that should be present in all of our work as we practice in all of our settings in schools and communities, regardless of where it is and in what specialty area. And those are autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, fidelity, and veracity. So hopefully those seem familiar to you, so I won't go into them in a great amount of detail, but we will talk about what these actually look like in a group setting, because that's where things get a little interesting, is how those come up when you have more than one client in the room. So in a group setting, what these end up looking like is this idea of autonomy, so empowering the client to make their own decisions. And we know in groups we have things like the groupthink phenomenon, where group members tend to align with the group leader or tend to align with each other and are trying to avoid conflict, so they may not be comfortable expressing their own needs or their own thoughts in a group setting. And so we have to be aware of this and promote that autonomy so that all of our group members feel safe and supported in being able to express their own perspectives and their own thoughts, set their own boundaries on what they're willing to do and what feels appropriate for them, and still have the right and ability to make their own decisions in the trajectory of the group experience. In terms of beneficence and promoting good for everyone in the group, this gets a little tricky when there's more than one client in the room because everyone needs something a little different. And so it's really important to make sure as group leaders that we're working for the betterment of the group as a whole and not just focusing on the betterment of what's going to work for one or two group members. And it can become very tempting when one group member is making a little more progress than others to try and really push that so that that individual can grow. But we can't do that in sacrifice of everyone else's growth process. And so it's really important to make sure as leaders and facilitators, we are working for the betterment of the whole group, but it's really also important to make sure that the group members are working in betterment of each other. And that the group doesn't become a harmful place where group members are stifling each other's growth in excuse of promoting their own. And they may not always realize that they are doing this, but it is very, very important that we make sure that we're facilitating and cultivating a safe and supported group space for everyone. And we do this by setting rules, by going through that informed consent process, and by making sure that we're monitoring and facilitating the group in a way that is protective and safe and supportive of everyone, and not allowing group members to create an unsafe space for each other. Sort of on the flip side of that, this non-maleficence or not doing any harm principle is this idea that group members may start to grow and change in a way that becomes potentially harmful to each other or to themselves. And so we have to make sure that in their growth process and in their challenging and confrontation and healthy conflict of each other, they're not creating trauma or harm for each other in that process as well. So we have to make sure that in each individual growing that they are not going to be in any way damaging each other or creating trauma for each other. So it's something that we have to always be monitoring and aware of. Further, we have to promote justice. This connects to the idea of a safe space in a group. and that everyone's welfare is promoted and protected. Everyone is treated the same, everyone has the same opportunities for engagement and growth. No one is singled out because they're different or because we're inappropriately having them represent a certain demographic or group. We'll get into this a lot. We talk about this a lot in the social justice chapter specifically. But this idea that any kind of characteristic or principle or identity that each group member has should not in any way impact the way that they interact with the group or are treated in a group or the growth opportunities that they have in a group. Further thinking about this idea of fidelity and honoring the informed consent process, making sure that everyone is clear about what they're getting into and what they're signing up for and what the purpose of the group is, and making sure that that group purpose is going to work for them, and making sure that we as group facilitators are keeping the group on track, or keeping them true to that group purpose that we were setting out to achieve, and making sure that we don't allow a group to drift into places that don't fit with that purpose and goal of the group. And then similarly, that idea of veracity, so modeling transparency and genuineness and being open and honest with the group members about what's going on, about what to expect, and about any changes that might occur as the group progresses. So we of course know about the ACA Code of Ethics and that it's a very important set of standards that we use in guiding our practice as practitioners. And it's this idea of principle, and we'll get into this idea of virtue and principle ethics that we follow. It is constantly evolving. So we have the most recent ACA Code of Ethics. I've not heard anything specific in terms of when they might be coming out with a new one, but I do know that they've recently put together committees to start looking at standards revisions. And so this is just a periodic process where they take the Code of Ethics and really dig in and see what kind of current event issues, what kind of changes in mandated care, what kind of things like technology use and other evolving trends that are coming up, and in what ways the Code of Ethics can be improved and to provide maybe a little bit more guidance and coverage in things that are coming up for practitioners. We know that it never gives us clear answers, but it are guidelines for practice. Further, the Association for Specialists in Group Work, which is one of the older divisions of ACA that's existed for quite a while, they came out with a best practices guide for group specialists. And so the most recent of that was in 2007. I'm not currently aware of any recent changes or revisions or any kind of work towards a new revision process for that. So we use the 2007 standards that they've put out. They do have a couple of different guides for individuals who want to specialize in group work. One of those is this best practices guide that's really meant to be a supplement to the ACA Code of Ethics. And it really just kind of more specifically addresses ethics in terms of group work. They also have a guide for social justice and diversity in groups, and they have a guide in training practices for group specialists. So all of those are available in our course materials online, and I encourage you to peruse them and get familiar with them and take a look at them. We'll go over some of the highlights of that best practices guide here in just a few minutes. But really it exists to highlight the importance of ethics in group work. And so it's really important that as a group facilitator, you are aware of and use all of those resources that are available to you, including ACA Code of Ethics, including the ASGW guide, including ethical decision-making models, to make sure that you're navigating your group facilitation process in the most ethical way possible. So these specific ASGW best practices, again, they're available on our course online. So I encourage you to take a look at them more specifically, but I did just kind of want to hit the highlights of them. They do discuss them a little in the book, but I think it's important for you to really look at them and see what they say specifically about group work. And so they talk about how professional disclosure is really important and how practitioners cannot just use the same professional disclosure statement that they use with individual clients. You really do need to develop a separate one for groups that talks about your approach to groups, confidentiality and ethical practice in groups, your experience and training in groups, So it's really important to have that professional disclosure statement for your group members, and that it's specifically tailored to the group work that you do. So that should be part of that screening process and part of that informed consent process, regardless of the type of group that you're leading. They also talk about the importance of member screening to make sure that everyone is appropriate for groups. We've talked about this earlier in the course, but it's really important in terms of ethics to make sure that group members are all going to be able to contribute to a positive growth environment for everyone involved. And so you're not introducing anyone who's not appropriate, who doesn't fit the purpose or the goal of the group, and is going to in any way represent potential harm to other group members. That informed consent process is also really important, especially around things like confidentiality, and making sure that group members are all really aware of the termination of the group, the terms of the group, the goals of the group, the purpose, and of any kind of expectations and rules that you have to create a positive group environment for everyone involved. ASGW does talk about training for group specialists. So according to CACREP, because you are having this training in this group class this semester, you have everything that you need to ethically be able to lead a group in your practice setting, regardless of if you are in a school, if you are in the community, regardless of what kind of training you end up getting after. This group class does, according to CACREP and ACA, give you what you need to be able to ethically lead a group because you have training. Now, ASGW talks about training for what they call group specialists. So individuals who want to specialize in groups, who want to claim that they are specialists in groups. And they say that one class in the CACREP core courses is not enough. That you really do have to pursue separate training, separate continuing education in the specific population and focus of groups and in how to lead groups. And so they have guidelines and training principles specifically for someone to call themselves a group specialist. And they talk about the importance of using continuing education specifically in group work to be able to maintain best practices and be able to confidently say that you're able to be a group specialist and to facilitate groups in your communities, in your schools, in your practice settings. They also talk about the importance of contemplative or reflective practice. So in a group setting, because we have those yellow therapeutic factors happening, we have so much going on, it really is a huge opportunity for things like countertransference for practitioners. And so ASGW talks about how important it is to use clinical supervision, to seek consultation with other practitioners, to use supports, to be able to be aware of your own biases, to monitor your own reactions to what's going on in your groups, and to make sure that things like countertransference are not coming up and happening for you. And so they really give some guidelines for how to use contemplative or reflective practice in group settings to make sure that those kinds of things are not interfering with your ability to lead a group ethically. So some of the major ethical dilemmas that you'll see come up in group work specifically is one of the biggest ones is the training of group leaders. And so we know that according to ACA, according to CACREP, in order to be able to lead a counseling or therapeutic group, you really do need to have specific training in how to use group practice and how to lead a group, and in basic training as a counselor or a helping professional. And so what we see quite often in schools, in community settings, in managed care settings, is a lack of resources. There's a lot of clients and not enough practitioners, not enough school counselors, not enough people to serve them. And so for a lot of people, groups represent this opportunity to get more bang for your buck, as you would. So this idea that you can put a lot of clients in a room and you can serve them at the same time. And so a lot of people like to use groups because it allows you to kind of maximize your client impact with the resources that you have. And what that ends up looking like often is that school administrators, community supervisors, managed care supervisors end up having individuals lead groups that aren't trained to do so. So things like psychoeducational groups, you don't have to have a master's in counseling to be able to do, but a lot of these quote-unquote psychoeducational groups drift into what really should look more like a counseling or a therapeutic group, and they're having them led by individuals who don't have any kind of appropriate training. They're just mental health techs or student teachers or occupational therapists, any kind of staff that they have available. Oh, why don't you lead this group? And we'll call it a skills group, but really it's meant to serve the purpose of something more like a counseling or a therapy group. And so it's really important for us to be aware of that happening, and to make sure as much as we're able to in those settings to be advocates for individuals to only do those groups when they have appropriate training. Now, that being said, if it's truly a psychoeducational group, it doesn't have to be a master's level clinician. In fact, a lot of times it's better for master's level clinicians to focus on more therapy and counseling focus groups, and for maybe bachelor's level techs or other individuals in a school to lead the psychoeducation groups. That's entirely appropriate. So it's just thinking about the best way to make sure that you're serving the clients who need the more intensive care, and they're not being put in these kind of pseudo psychoeducational groups, being led by individuals who don't have the training that they really need for ethical practice. Screening is hugely important. We know informed consent is critical. Informed consent is your savior. It is how you make sure that clients know what to expect from therapy. And that's just as important, if not more so, in a group setting. So making sure that you're not introducing group members that are going to be potentially harmful or really inappropriate, and also making sure that you're going through that informed consent process and revisiting that informed consent process consistently through your group process. It's really important to be aware of the rights of group members and promoting those rights. We know that you cannot guarantee confidentiality in a group, just because you can't guarantee group members are going to honor confidentiality for each other. However, I, as a group facilitator, will honor confidentiality, and especially in things like mandated groups, things like people like probation officers may want to press me and know about what's going on in a group. I don't have to disclose that information. I have to make sure that I'm acting ethically. And so I might be able to work out something where I communicate attendance, but I'm not disclosing anything that's going on in the group. But my first responsibility is to the confidentiality of the clients that are in the group setting, even if they don't have that responsibility ethically or legally to each other. Now, in the case of individuals under 18 and maybe school or community settings where they don't have that legal right to confidentiality, we operate in the same capacity as we do with individuals. So we talk about why it's important for us to honor that confidentiality with their parents or guardians, with their school administrators, and how that's really helpful in the therapeutic process, and really emphasizing with the group members why it's so important for them to honor that confidentiality and respect for each other, especially in schools, because things disclosed in groups can represent opportunities for things like bullying, for discrimination. It's so important that clients understand the limits to confidentiality in a group in their choice to disclose things, and that you emphasize that you're asking and expecting them to respect each other in that way. Multiple relationships become a huge issue with groups. Not just my multiple relationships with group members, but with each other. And so it's important in screening group members to make sure that we're minimizing those as much as possible. In rural communities, we know that everybody knows everybody. We can't always minimize those things, but it is important for us to really determine if that multiple relationship is going to be something detrimental to the group. So if it's something like a past romantic relationship, probably isn't going to work. But our parents used to work together, maybe is fine. So really considering what's going to be the best therapeutic environment for everyone involved, and being aware of that as the group goes on, because we know that in groups you have a connection, you create that cohesion, you have this therapeutic process and go through these stages. It's natural for group members to develop attraction to each other, to want to start romantic relationships or friendships with each other. They feel really connected. And so it's important to talk about why having relationships outside of the group during the group is not helpful to the group process. And I have to monitor that to make sure that I'm conducting ethically the group that I'm leading. And so that's something that it's really important to be aware of, because they may not always be honest with you about that if it's going on. So other major issues that might come up is use of group techniques. Just like with individual practice, we can't use anything that we're not ethically trained to do. So if I'm not trained in DBT, I cannot lead a DBT group. We have to make sure that any kind of techniques, any kind of activities, any kind of anything that we're trying to, play therapy, whatever it is in a group setting, I have to make sure that I'm trained and appropriate to use those things in the group setting, and that they're going to be appropriate for all of the group members and the purpose of the group. So just like we talked about how activities need to be intentional, we have to make sure that we're using them ethically as well. We talked a little bit about reflective practice and contemplative practice when we talked about the ASGW guidelines. That's really important. So our biases, our values, they come out a lot in groups. And so just being aware of that, reflective of that, and seeking that consultation, using those ethical decision-making models to make sure that our own values and biases are not playing into the way that we interact with and lead our groups. We have to make sure that we're using appropriate referrals. So if I screen someone out of a group, I have to give them a referral. I can't just say, no, you can't be in my group. I have to make sure that I'm giving them an appropriate referral for some other kind of therapeutic avenue that's going to be appropriate for them if I determine that they're not going to be a good fit for my group experience. Similarly, I need to monitor what's going on with group members, and if it seems like they need additional supports to what they're getting in my group, I have an ethical responsibility to make sure that they're either already getting that or give an appropriate referral for some individual, some more intensive services, whatever it is, and follow up to make sure that they're using those referrals as much as I possibly can. Similarly, when we terminate a group, we have to make sure that we're giving referrals if needed for some kind of aftercare or follow-up or intensive services if it's needed. Just like with individual, failure to keep records is one of the highest instances of malpractice for clinicians. So we have to make sure that we're keeping appropriate and HIPAA-compliant records with groups, just like we do with individuals, and doing what's appropriate for our setting. So in schools, this might look a little differently than in community settings, but we have to make sure that we're doing what's expected of us ethically and legally in terms of our practice settings. And then finally, making sure that we're using ethical practice in terms of termination. So making sure that clients understand how long the group's going to last, when that ending is coming up, and then making sure that when we close a group that we're doing it in a way where clients are safe to go home, we aren't leaving them with all of this raw emotional baggage that they need to navigate, and that we're using appropriate follow-ups to make sure that clients are still doing well after the conclusion of the group. So I'm not going to go into this in a great amount of detail. We know that we should use our ethical decision-making model anytime these dilemmas come up. And so we should do that in consideration of both principle and virtue ethics. Principle ethics being those kind of minimum obligations of practice, and virtue ethics being those aspirational best practices that we talk about. So promoting ethical principles in groups. The first of this is just really making sure that individuals leading therapeutic groups in schools and communities have appropriate training. Luckily, you will all graduate from your CACREP accredited program with the appropriate training that you need, but really also visiting those ASGW guidelines if you want to pursue the ability to call yourself a group specialist, making sure that you're doing that in a way that's ethical and accurate, and using advocacy in your practice settings. So if you see groups being led by individuals who don't have appropriate training, using your voice, talking about ways to make that more ethical and to make sure that clients are really getting the supports that they need in their group settings. If you're going to be doing groups consistently or wanting to call yourself a group specialist, it's really important to seek continuing education specifically in group practice, and to use supervision and peer consultation with individuals who have expertise in groups so that they can help you when you have questions, when you're uncertain about what to do, when you have ethical dilemmas come up. As you're navigating that decision-making process, it's really important to seek out someone who has understanding and expertise in groups because they might have better perspective and experience to be able to help you navigate those issues. So here are some suggestions and thoughts and ways to prevent lawsuits and malpractice, and to make sure that you're really conducting yourself in an ethical way in group practice. So screening, we talk about this a lot, but it's just so important. Screening out inappropriate and potentially harmful group members, and documenting that you did it and why you did it, and making sure you're giving appropriate referrals. So it really is important to spend time setting up a group properly, making sure everyone's informed and aware of the purpose of the group, making sure you're screening everyone properly, making sure that in that group, that first group meeting, you really are going over informed consent, going over your professional disclosure, going over your group rules and expectations, responsibilities to each other, cultivating that positive and helpful and therapeutic environment for your group members, and making sure that you're documenting that you're doing it in a way that's appropriate for your clinical setting. Of course, we always want to follow the ethical codes and standards, use ethical decision-making models, and document when you're going through using all of those things. Using only theories and techniques that you have expertise in, we've talked about this. Thinking about things like minors, and working with clients under 18, and then getting consent from their parent or guardian as appropriate, or getting permission from their parent in your school setting as appropriate for them to be in groups. Making sure that you talk about confidentiality, and making sure, you can never say it enough times, that group members really understand the limits to confidentiality when they're in a therapeutic group. And talking about potential consequences that you'll enforce as part of your group rules. You can have consequences that you can enforce when individuals violate the confidentiality of each other. There's nothing legally or ethically that you can do to punish that person, but you can make it grounds for dismissal from your group setting. That's perfectly appropriate. And again, I can't say enough, you always want to document when you're doing that and why you're doing that, but it is appropriate to make that a consequence and to make sure everyone is aware of that consequence, so that if it comes up, you have that clear expectation that you can revisit and fall back on, and consequences that you can invoke. It's really important to do that continuing education after you complete your program. So after you go out into the world and become counselors, you have to make sure that you're becoming trained on when the new ACA Code of Ethics does come out at some point in the future, that you know it, that you get trained in it. If there's a new DSM, if there are new ASGW standards, it's really important to make sure that you're kind of staying in touch with what's coming up in the field and what we know and what we're learning about ethical practice and theory and techniques, especially if you're specializing in group work. Making sure you're doing that continuing education is really important. You want to make sure that you're always staying true to those values. So empowering group members, making sure that you're promoting those values of counselors, and using appropriate program evaluation and evaluation of your own work, and for group members to be able to evaluate their own progress and goals. And that way they really feel empowered and like they're directive of their own experience, because it's really easy as a group facilitator to become kind of dominant in the group and to be the biggest voice in the group, and that's not really how group process should work. And so it's important to make sure that you're doing and using tools in your group that are empowering, so group members can really feel like they're directive in their own process. And evaluation can be a really great way to remind group members that they are the directors of their own experience, that they are really important stakeholders in the therapeutic process. Supervision is helpful. I encourage people to use consultation and supervision even after they don't have to. So like school counselors, use your resources, use individuals that you know, seek out supervision and consultation. Community counselors, even after you have your LPC and you don't have to, it's always helpful to continue to use supervision and consultation, because things keep coming up and we can become complacent when we don't have to have those things in place anymore. So they're really great tools to keep in place even after you're no longer required to use them. And of course, we always want to make sure that we're using appropriate billing and record keeping, and that we're doing everything that's compliant with our billing, with our insurance guidelines, with what our school covers us to do in terms of liability, and make sure that we're always documenting everything in a way that's appropriate for your clinical setting.